Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Sree Koka. I am a member of the Executive MBA class of 2013, and I'm very honored to be the chair of the MIT Sloan Alumni Board. The Alumni Board was created a few years ago by the Office of External Relations at MIT Sloan to provide a conduit for alumni, a cohort of alumni who represent different class years and different programs, to share perspectives about the alumni experience, bring that experience back to Sloan, and also be an extension of Sloan to try and serve Sloan's mission even better. Now, the mission of Sloan is to develop principled, innovative leaders who change the world. I'm sure it's no accident that principled comes first. And today, we are going to be talking about the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And nothing could be more important to the principles on which Sloan is founded than these three issues. The Black Lives Matter movement, though, has really reinvigorated our conversation. The Alumni Board last year was pleased to have a small representation on the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force and make a contribution to that report. But the recent events have really caused us to revisit this issue and what are our actions as a school. So today, with this presentation and this Q&A session, the school would like to get the alumni's feedback and input on diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges and opportunities, and also to hear what the school is doing at this current time. We're going to hear from Fiona Murray and Ray Reagans in a few minutes. Fiona joined the faculty in 1999. She is the William Porter Professor of Entrepreneurship, an associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and she is the Associate Dean of MIT's Innovation Initiative. So the perfect person to be part of the conversation. Ray Reagans has been on the Sloan faculty for over 10 years. He is the Alfred P. Sloan Professor of Management. He is Professor of Organizational Studies, and he is also the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. These two positions are relatively new. Fiona and Ray have just adopted these positions July 1 of this year, but they've also accomplished a lot already and are willing to share that information with us. So it's with great pleasure that I turn the baton over to Fiona and Ray to talk us through all the exciting things that are happening on this very, very important initiative at this time.
Thank you, Sree.
Thank you.
I'm going to start sharing my screen and start a presentation. Fiona, can you see it?
I can see the presentation, and it's actually beautiful just to see a photograph of the Sloan School and the Charles River. Even though most of us can't spend any time there at the moment, it's absolutely wonderful just to be reminded of the place that really is generally the heart of our community.
Home.
Home, indeed.
So thanks everyone for joining us today. We wanted to share with you some initial steps that we've been taking with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion. But before we do that, we thought it would be important to provide broader context. And we thought it might be a good idea to start with an even broader context, a historical context. And I might accomplish that with two stories. And the first story is, my daughter's a junior, well, she's a senior now. And last year she was taking a test in her history class. And the question was, name the largest ethnic group in the antebellum South. And she picked Irish. And her teacher told her, when she got her test back, the teacher marked it wrong and told her she was wrong and that the largest ethnic group, African Americans. And my daughter said, but they were slaves, they didn't count as people. This is important. If you were to look at the census before and after 1865, before 1865 in the census, African Americans were counted with the livestock and the property. After 1865, there was a significant increase in the population in the South. The history teacher was at least wise enough to change his answer in response to my daughter's concern. But slavery didn't end in 1865. In fact, one of my most proud moments to be a faculty member at Sloan occurred on Juneteenth, when I would send emails to my colleagues and I would receive back from them messages describing they were unavailable and why they were unavailable. And they were engaged in workshops that were organized by members of the staff that allowed people to gain some insight into African American history and what it meant to be African American in the US. The next story I'll share with you comes from Melissa Nobles, which provides some insight into what the Jim Crow South was like. The Jim Crow South is when many of the images of African Americans as being subhuman and criminals emerged. And it emerged out of a need to create free labor. I'll note that many of those images that were used to dehumanize African Americans were also used to dehumanize Asian Americans. And Ronald Takaki has a wonderful book on this. Melissa Nobles has this project, a historical project, where they look through history and they try to find out what happened to African American men, in particular, just in the Jim Crow South. Men would be randomly rounded up, taken off to jail, and often murdered. And the families wouldn't know what happened to their loved ones. Melissa has done the hard work of telling these stories. The story that she shared, I believe, in the Boston Globe was a story of a man named George Floyd. The irony that she could find a very similar experience in our history to the experience that led to, I don't have the correct word for it, the Black Lives Matter movement at a different scale. As you can imagine, people wanted to escape the Jim Crow South, so that led to migration into cities. And as the US began to deindustrialize, you then had a concentration of poverty in those cities. That leads to many of the images that you see during those protests. Anyone who knows history knows that that was a very thin slice of our history. I encourage you to look for other sources. Brown University has a very nice source on slavery and justice. And I mention Brown not only because I went there, but because John Brown was a slave trader. And the official name for the state of Rhode Island is Rhode Island and the Providence Plantations. I share this with you. It's important for us to realize the historical context in which we operate and the legacy of that history on what we continue to see and experience today. I'll hand it over to you now, Fiona.
Thank you, Ray. And so maybe in the next slide, and the one after that. So against that, I think, rich and obviously troubling historical context, in the summer of 2019, MIT Sloan launched its Diversity and Inclusion Task Force. This was a task force that I think came at an important moment. It was a task force that responded, I think, to a very strong desire and observation by some of our then current students, our alum, particularly some of our alum who were serving on our executive board, and others in our community, recognizing that there was more that Sloan should, could, and really must do around diversity and inclusion. And while I think that much of the impetus for that focused on diversity with respect to race, particularly underrepresented minorities and our Black community, it also focused on gender, on disabilities, on those with different sexual orientation. And so the task force was launched in September, in the summer of 2019. It was chaired by Ezra Zuckerman, who at the time was our faculty member deputy dean, and Kelly Imberman, who's the executive director for human resources. I think perhaps the most important thing to say about this task force is that it very much was an effort that represented the shared and collective conversations among faculty, staff, alumni, and students. And in fact, as you'll see, as we start to present and talk about what Ray and I have in mind and what we're trying to take forward, those are the four, if you like, stakeholder groups that we think are very important to work with, whom we're talking to, listening to, empowering, we hope, and serving. It's also, I think, reasonably unusual to have all four of those groups really represented together. And I think that makes for sometimes some challenging conversations, but also some really, really important conversations, because at the end of the day, we want to create a community that is a collective community for all of us. The task force had some really important recommendations about how we might improve diversity, equity, and inclusion. It did some of the hard work that has laid the groundwork so that Ray and I, as we have come into our roles, are able to understand what Sloan has already done, how this fits into some of the broader efforts that have happened in the past at MIT, what some of our other business school colleagues have done, our peer institutions, and it's helped us think about some of the DEI priorities and how we might really focus on those. And as this says, it's helped us understand some of the structures and incentives and reporting relationships. So it's done some of that groundwork, and it's made our life much easier to have that already in place. And so we're incredibly appreciative of the time that many people have spent on that. As you can see in this next slide, it had a number of recommendations. And one of the recommendations, and I think it would be fair to say, one of the tensions in any of these things is to really say, well, how do we take forward an agenda around diversity and inclusion? And I think the big tension is one of sort of centralization versus decentralization. If it becomes the responsibility of one person, that person is responsible. And yet it sometimes means that everybody else could just sit back and say, oh, we don't need to worry about this anymore because this person over here is taking charge. If you make it completely distributed, then the opposite problem happens. Everybody thinks, well, okay, we'll all have to do a little bit, but then nobody is responsible. And so the way in which the Dean and Dave has chosen to structure this is to ask Ray and myself to take on this role as Associate Deans jointly. And I think for us, being a team and working as a team is an incredibly important part of this. We're there for one another. We are there, as Ray, I think, very nicely puts it, when one of us gets tired, the other one seems to have had enough coffee and is awake to sort of hand off, and we try to do this together. So we are responsible, and Dave has given us that responsibility, but we will be working very closely with some of the leading the staff members in the school to take this agenda forward, our faculty colleagues, working closely with current students, and I think perhaps most important of all, working with our alum, because you all have both your lived experience of Sloan and what you hope for Sloan going forward, but also your experience out in the world in many, many different organizations. And so we were appointed in April, officially taking our role on the 1st of July, but really spent some time in May starting to think about what we would do and really understand and appreciate how much has already been done. And then I think it would be fair to say that the moment intervened. And so, we appreciate that then in late May, we had the terrible murder of George Floyd, and we see what happened. And I think it would be appropriate to say that that gave us an incredibly important mandate to take forward our work with an extraordinary sense of urgency. It was important to us from the moment we accepted the role, but I think that really did change things. So maybe, Ray, I could hand back over to you.
Thank you, Fiona. So I think this was actually a very important moment for our community, because as the Black Lives Movement was happening in the streets in the US, COVID was happening, and our community was fragmented. And the members of our BBSA community felt that they hadn't heard from the MIT community support. And they reached out to us. And I would like to say that together we put on a town hall, but what really happened is that they organized a town hall. Fiona and I have a megaphone and we have a stage. And they were brave enough to step out onto that stage and to share their stories and to share our stories. And it was through that sharing that the community of MIT, Sloan, came together. And Dave, our partner in every way, he sometimes likes to say that Fiona and I are driving the car. I don't know how that quite works, but that works for me as an image. And he's putting gasoline in the car. That's not quite true. We're all in the front seat together. And what you see in front of us now, this is Dave. This is Dave making a statement of solidarity. We now, in our opinions, have a mandate because every member of our community supports what we're hoping to achieve. But it's important to remember that in our opinion, this mandate was given to us the night of the BBSA town hall. They mobilized this community. They're the gasoline. Back to you, Fiona.
So, as this says, we've shifted, I think, to something that is an important idea, that this is not business as usual. I think it would be all too easy in many organizations to say, all right, you know, we had this moment, it was a moment of profound importance, but we'll just carry on with business as usual and we'll approach diversity and inclusion like we always have. I think that for us, this is not business as usual. We're trying to do things differently. We're trying to do things in a way that will be robust, that will really deliver the sorts of change that we all need. As I've already said, I think we feel as if we have a mandate. One of the most important things, I think, is that, as many of you know, faculty have an important place in academia and in management schools. And so we know if we lend our voice, sometimes we actually have to be very careful with that. When we say things, people assume it has to get done, when sometimes Ray and I are just thinking out loud. And so trying to lend our voice, supporting the staff, who are often the people who really are the ones who drive some change, and supporting our faculty colleagues. One of the most sort of salient examples for me that this is not business as usual is really in how some of the changes to the core curriculum and the core are really happening as we speak, and we'll have a very different core experience delivered in the fall. Most obviously it's going to be different because it will be delivered in this really challenging hybrid way, both in person and online. But I think actually what's different, the real difference that's really important, and I think will stand the test of time, is the fact that questions around diversity, equity, and inclusion will be incorporated into every single one of our core courses. That's a hard thing to do by sort of fiat. Ray and I can't tell our faculty colleagues what to do, but led by Rodrigo, who's the faculty member who leads the EMBA, our faculty colleagues have absolutely stepped up to the challenge. How do we have these conversations? How do we bring research to bear? And one of the things that I think has driven their desire to do that this time was that many of them listened to the BBSA students at the town hall. And at least half of them are like me, not born in the United States, and who have a really different understanding and appreciation of American history and some of these challenges. We have our own challenges of race and diversity and inclusion in places where we're from, but our colleagues were incredibly moved, as we were, with the passion and commitment and the pain that our students were feeling. And I think this has really changed the urgency for them to have those conversations in the classroom. And so this is definitely not business as usual. We also recognize that lots of efforts at DEI have failed, and we want to think about how to make sure that we intervene in this complex system in ways that will have the long-term sort of effect that we really want to have. Part of that is going to be structural, but we also want to take a very MIT approach, thinking about mind and hand, mens et manus, evidence and action, thinking and doing. And so we have actually started, as you might expect, from the research base. There's a tremendous amount of diversity, equity, inclusion research out there. And as we started to read and think about some of the best insights that we could gather from academic studies, from this wide range of literature, we actually realized that we have many of the relevant experts sitting on our doorstep. They are our colleagues, whether it's Roberto Fernandez and his work on glass ceiling effects and hiring pipelines, colleagues like Danielle Lee and our graduate student Lindsay doing fascinating work on algorithms and algorithmic exploration to increase diversity in hiring, work that Kate Kellogg and others have done on diversity, Erin Kelly's work in flexible work arrangements. And then Ray and I have both, as scholars, paid a lot of attention to issues of diversity in our own research. And I would just highlight some of Ray's work around issues of sort of cultural fit and how we understand cultures. So this is very much the foundation for what we're going to do and what we are doing. We're really informed by the evidence. But before we shift to sort of the framework, Ray, is there anything else do you want to pick up? I know you like to pick up a few examples from here.
You know, Fiona, I want you to describe your research on interview bias. If you want, I will. But
Go on. You can do that.
Okay, I will do it. I need for people to appreciate this. So studying venture capital, studying pitches, and the questions that people receive. And what Fiona has discovered in her research is that men are often asked questions about why their businesses would do well. And they describe why their businesses would do well. Women are often asked questions about why their business might fail. And they describe what they would do to prevent their business from failing. The very questions that they're asked create images. One image is of someone who's a risk taker, the men. The other image is of someone who's risk averse, the women. And people who are risk seekers are more likely to receive funding. This bias in the questions that are asked creates these images that then lead to the funding decisions and inequality. Powerful research. Fiona will not describe it, so I have to do it. So that means you have to describe my work on culture.
That's very, very unfair of you. I think that's Ray. I mean, look, there's a number of really important insights. I think perhaps the most powerful for me is that as we think about different groups who feel in the minority in any given organization, the kind of culture that helps them and allows them to feel included may be different. And that what women want as an inclusive culture, may be focused on diversity and difference and recognizing difference and how that adds value. Individuals in an organization who might be from a different race or underrepresented minorities want something else from the culture to recognize their difference in other ways and think more about equity. And so I think what that reminds us of is that we're not just building something that is about changing structures and pipelines and architecting the organization. We are in the business of trying to shape the culture. And so I think on the next slide, it won't come as any great surprise to you, especially those of you who graduated recently enough to remember the 3 lenses from OP, that we are actually taking a sort of 3-lens approach to how we're doing our work. Ray and I are both, as former engineers, lapsed engineers, I think we may describe ourselves, quite comfortable with the blue lens, the strategic engagement, the strategic re-architecting of the organization, whether it's in interview approaches and pipelines and sampling and oversampling from different groups as we think about admissions and hiring and so on. But we also recognize the importance of really trying to build a connected community. So thinking about the networks, the red lens, if you like, and thinking about what it would mean to be a community that feels more connected across different affinity groups, more connected between staff and faculty, faculty and students, students and staff. And I think the third piece, which really does sort of speak to Ray's work, is how we build a constructive culture, and a culture that recognizes diversity in different ways, and a culture that allows for constructive conversations about difference. Because we're such a global community, I think that's especially important, because speaking as somebody who came to the United States, for whom some of this was difficult and new and complicated 20 years ago, making sure that we have the capacity not just to recognize difference, but when we have questions, we need to be able to talk about those things. And so we really think that being good at having difficult conversations is part of a constructive culture that we'd like to build together at Sloan.
So we'll briefly discuss some of the things that we're doing. And which one do we want to start with? I think let's start with Staff Matters. It's the first one on the slide. Like many people in organizations, the members of our staff do not feel that their voices are always heard. And some steps that we are taking are looking for projects that we can work on as a community, faculty and staff, that allows for more voices to be added to the discussions that we're having. Another challenge that we have is our representation. And often that lack of representation is a lack of representation of the people who are doing the interviewing. And so we're trying to introduce more diverse interview panels. Guided by Fiona's research on interview bias, we're also trying to introduce more structured interviews. I should say adding more structured interviews. In many parts of our organization, we already have it. In fact, we have many of the best practices in the industry. We just need to use them more systematically. I'll let you pick the next one, Fiona.
Thank you. So when it comes to students, I think, as I've said, we are working with admissions to think about how we use some of these structures around interviewing, how we think about the pipeline, and also, frankly, how we think about, once we've admitted students, how we make sure that they choose to come to Sloan. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is making sure that, extraordinarily talented students across, a whole bunch of dimensions, how do we make sure that those people actually choose to join our community and become part of MIT Sloan? We've talked a little bit about the core curriculum, and that's a really important shift for us, is making sure that and structuring that around questions of bias and implicit bias, we think really grounds this in a much deeper understanding of some of the things that really do lead to the challenges in our community, and thinking about orientation, particularly ensuring that we are in a position to start to have challenging conversations that we need to have. We'll be then asking students to reflect on that and how that experience has gone from the arc from orientation through the core. SIP, as some of you will know, has been moved to December. So we'll be asking them to reflect on that in SIP. And then we're also thinking about alumni. We rely on you in many ways as our alum to help expand the role models that our students see in the classroom, to help, as I know you already have, with career opportunities, particularly in these quite difficult times, and internships and other sorts of mentoring, and to really kind of deepen the diversity of engagement that our students have and the role models that they see. And we know a number of you have stepped up to engage with our different affinity groups and support those different student clubs and organizations, and that's something that we really appreciate. And then with faculty, Ray, I think you're leading on quite a lot of that. So
involved. So I think the lovely is the word I'll use, is that we're actually partnering with our peer institutions to imagine ways that we can draw more talented people into our pipelines. And so Sloan currently has an informal pre-doc program. And by pre-doc, it's people graduate, and before they enter the PhD program, they have an opportunity to work with faculty members on different projects to get a feel for what that is like. Many of our peer institutions have more formal programs, and we're currently in discussions with them to establish a pre-doc program at Sloan. But we all would benefit from these by adding more people to the pipeline. But a second piece is we can't keep searching in the same places. We need to encourage people to come in from other disciplines and join us in management schools. In fact, our new dean of faculty is like me, and like Fiona actually, who's come from outside of the business school and made a transition into business school life. We will hope to create more postdocs that create a similar transition for people from outside the management discipline. And finally, we know we can do a better job with our senior lecturers, who are a critical part of the Sloan community. They represent a unique opportunity to add more diversity to our teaching ranks. And I guess we'll call these start values. I guess we'll just show these. I'm not sure what we could say. This is where we stand, and we take these as start values. Right? It's very important for people to appreciate that we do not control yields. And so therefore it would be unwise for us, unlegal for us, to have targets as goals. But we take these as start values. This is how we're doing. And we often get asked questions about Black students in particular, So we would share these numbers with you. And you can see that in general, there's a trend moving up. That isn't to suggest that we couldn't do more. In fact, we are doing more to increase the representation of African Americans, and in fact, of URMs and diverse groups in general into the Sloan community. And now I think it's our time to hand it back over to you, Sree.
Thank you, Fiona and Ray. That was great. As an alum, I have to say I was very moved, but also very proud, not just of the fact that Sloan is talking about this, but of your sincerity and your commitment to really making a difference here. It came through loud and clear, and thank you both very much for taking on the responsibility, because it is a big one. The bridge here is the metaphor for our role as alumni to bring outside information, bring the world to MIT, to Fiona and Ray, and share what the challenges in the world are when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges. But also then for us to be messengers, to be disciples that can share the good work, the great work, the very important work that is happening at Sloan, and share that with our colleagues and our communities, and maybe take some of those learnings and implement them. So I would like to see the alumni maybe even being a resource for you, Ray and Fiona, as places to pilot some of your initiatives and see whether they work and how well they work. So thank you both again very, very much. And now it's time to take the questions from alumni and hear your answers. So thank you again.
Thank you, Sree.
Thank you. And I think a couple of people just asked whether we'd make the slides available with some of the data. And I think we are, as far as I understand, I think we're happy to do that.
Yes, we are.
Great, thank you, Ray and Fiona and Sree. We now have time for questions, feedback, and suggestions from the audience. So as a reminder to our viewers, you may type those into the Q&A panel in the Zoom interface. And Ray and Fiona, first, congratulations on your appointments. I know this is a very exciting step for the school moving forward. But perhaps we could start with a question on how you both interface with the rest of the campus, and in particular, the Institute Community and Equity Office at MIT, and how you see that relationship going forward.
I'll take this one, Fiona. I'm trying to read questions and listen at the same time.
Yes.
So it's funny, we've struck a balance between the centralization and autonomy that Fiona was describing that we will use at Sloan. We clearly are partnering with MIT Central, Tim and John. In fact, we wanted that to be a tetrahedron, but we couldn't get it to be a tetrahedron right now. That emerged. Tim's a chemist. That emerged from discussions with them, where MIT Central has an image of what the strategic plan should be. And as we looked at their plan, we said, man, that sounds a lot like the three lenses. And we thought about ways that we can make their plan uniquely our own. And so we see this as a partnership with MIT Central. But people need to recognize that in many ways, Sloan can move more quickly than the entire institution. So we also appreciate our autonomy.
I think it would also be fair to say that we're fortunate that we have, as Ray says, built good relationships both with John Dozier, who is new to MIT in the formal role, and then the associate provost Tim Jameson, who, as Ray mentioned, is he's actually a professor in the chemistry department, and somebody whom I know from graduate school. A few of you who know me will know that my graduate school training was in engineering, but I'm a chemist originally, and so I actually TA'd in the chemistry department, and so I know Tim from then. And I think, sometimes just having these long-standing relationships just makes things a little easier, and we appreciate some of the best practice that MIT has. I would say MIT has a particularly interesting best practice when it comes to outreach into high schools, to really build a diverse pipeline of young people coming into MIT itself, and that's something that I think is to be really commended. And we can also think about MIT students as potential students to welcome into Sloan later on as they think about the next stages of their education.
Great, thank you both. We've had a few questions come in, both that were pre-submitted and live, that relate to metrics. Could you share a little bit about what you're thinking in terms of measures, goals, and kind of where you see things in the next year or even a little bit further out?
It's interesting. I think our metrics will be even harder to measure. Where we're primarily concerned with issues of community, how people experience Sloan as an institution and as a community. And we were having a discussion during our Sloan values and norms work stream. And we were asking our students to think about ways that we could stay safe together. And one of the solutions suggested that, I would remind people when they were falling short of our values and our principles. And someone said, well, not everyone's going to feel comfortable doing that. You'd have to feel privileged to do that. And that's the culture and climate that we're trying to create, where everyone feels that kind of privilege. There's survey data that we can collect to tell us to what extent we're approaching that, but ultimately we're trying to create a community where everyone feels whole. We understand that representation is a key part of that, and we drive for those kinds of improvements as well, but ultimately we're trying to create a community where everyone feels whole.
Great, thank you both. I would love to turn back to the slide you shared on faculty research. And I'm sure, as Fiona mentioned, we're going to be sharing the slides, but alumni always ask for that. And I think that is such a rich slide to show the breadth of work that is happening at Sloan from our faculty. One of the questions that came in was, how do you take that work and then translate it into management practices and share it in the world? If you could share what you've observed from the faculty.
Sure. I mean, why don't I sort of start off? And I think, there've been a number of comments about what tools and philosophy we're using, and whether I think the comment said anti-racism tools and philosophy. I think the tools and philosophy that we're using are grounded in the research base. And let me just pick up on the research that I've done, myself, that Ray has talked about. What the research does is it shows us some of the processes that are at work. There's at least at the level of specific human interactions, whether it's in the form of an interview, pitching, how people evaluate the different ideas, particularly in innovation, which is the area I know best. You can really, what the research helps us do is both identify that there are biases, because that is often something that remains a subject for conversation, and people need to have the evidence presented to them. And then we have other work that really helps us think about what works and what to do in terms of interventions. I just want to give you a really simple one. One thing that we think about a lot is, particularly in innovation and entrepreneurship, which is an important part of what we do at MIT, is to make sure that those sorts of activities feel inclusive and that people feel welcome. One of the questions you might have is, how do we advertise and talk about those things and represent them visually and in the language that we use in ways that cause men and women, people of different race and background and orientation, to feel like they're welcome in those activities. I've done some recent work that shows that when you actually show different images and posters, if you take co-founders and you show a female image and a male image, the click-through rate of interest by the young men who are looking at this and thinking, is this for me, really doesn't vary. For the young women, when they see an image of a role model who is female, they click through at a much higher rate. What that shows us is that we can use our research to really kind of shape the particular interventions that we do. And we can use the research, I think, to understand the types of culture and community that people actually want to feel that they belong. And so we're building on individual experiences, but also the cumulative research. So that's how I would see that, as tools to guide what we're doing.
Thank you, Fiona. And perhaps sticking with this topic for just a little while longer, there are some questions about entrepreneurship and how can we as Sloan, as a leader in this space, bring DE&I efforts to the world in that way?
They keep falling in your wheelhouse, Fiona.
Maybe, Greg, you can reframe the question for me. I'm not sure I fully understand.
Let's see.
So
how might Sloan engage with the broader venture capital ecosystem?
Thank you. All right. So I have two thoughts about that. And one is something that is a work in progress that Ray and I are thinking about. Obviously, Sloan and MIT don't sit in a vacuum. They sit in Boston. You know, the M in MIT is the Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is, and Boston in particular, you know, when you actually look at rankings of innovation ecosystems and places to start businesses, to innovate, places that drive those high growth innovation driven enterprises, with respect to gender and gender oriented inclusion, Boston actually does quite well. And you can see that even in some of the very specific numbers and statistics around things like patenting and what have you. When it comes to race, Boston does not feel as inclusive and welcoming. And so I think it's an important moment for us to actually have a series of community conversations with members of the Greater Boston innovation ecosystem about that, and bring together stakeholders from state and local government, with corporate leaders, with investors, with our entrepreneurs about those topics, to understand it and to think about what MIT can do and how we can be part of that. Certainly, you're all right that in venture capital and what have you, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on a whole variety of dimensions. I think even just the recognition of the numbers and also the mechanisms driving some of those numbers is important. Asking, you know, really taking a leading position. So for example, the Engine, which is MIT's more recently created venture fund focused on tough tech with Katie Ray, is taking very seriously thinking about the composition of the teams that are being recruited, the boards and what have you, and really asking all of you, many of you are in positions of influence with respect to your investment and also the boards that you help create as you're thinking about, for example, in private equity. So we, I think, have a shared responsibility to do that. And so I think there's work we can do, but we can also share thought leadership and new approaches.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, still sticking with industry for just a moment, are there efforts in place to better engage Fortune 100 or 500 companies where MIT alumni are currently employed to assist in DE&I efforts?
So I can't say recently because I don't remember the exact date, but we had a webinar with the Career Development Office where we invited many of our largest employers, and we shared with them the initiatives that we're taking. And we made the offer to them to partner and looking for opportunities to do even more research on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if there are alums out there who would like to partner with faculty, we're certain they would welcome that opportunity because it's very consistent with Mind in Hand. So when we send back the slides, you'll see which faculty members are working in which area, and we'd love to facilitate those connections.
Great, thanks, Ray. So we've had quite a few questions from alumni asking how they can offer their own expertise to help. What would you recommend?
And so one thing that came up in the task force report was this feeling by underrepresented minorities that their stories were not being told in the core. And as Fiona has pointed out on a number of occasions, we're not Harvard. We don't write cases. In fact, it would take too long for those stories to be told if we simply depended on the cases being written at Harvard. And in fact, they may not reflect our values as a school. We think that our alums, independent of their demography, represent the kinds of stories that we would like to see told in our classrooms, and we welcome them into the classrooms as speakers. That's one way.
Thank you. So one of the questions that came in relates back to admissions. And so I'll read the question here. So it feels there's a great emphasis on getting diversity into the broader Sloan community. I was wondering your thoughts on putting these diversity measures into action. So how do we include them? So actually create an inclusive Sloan culture once folks are here at Sloan, rather than just a focus on diversity.
You broke up a little. Can I take?
Oh.
Please go right ahead then.
I would just answer that. So I think if the question is, once we get people, yes. So I think one of the reasons, diversity, equity, inclusion, right? It's who's here, whether they feel equally engaged, appreciated, they have access to the same kinds of resources and opportunities. And then it is that people feel included. They actually feel welcome and seen and understood and heard. An important part of what we're doing, particularly in orientation at the core, is to particularly build this idea of community, to give ourselves the tools for some of these more challenging conversations, because people have different points of view and different lived experiences. And especially to do that across not only some of the sort of the fault lines of diversity that we've been talking about, whether that's race or gender, or sexual orientation, physical disabilities, but also recognizing that we have a very significant fraction of our students are international and whose lived experience of some of these things and whose cultural reference points and own national histories are just different. And so a lot of that, and I will say that the training and how the quality of how we do that well, the evidence is really mixed. And so that would be a great area where some of your expertise would be really valuable. We've all been through training programs, some of which are dreadful and some of which are really powerful. And so trying to sort of sort out what's really good quality and what actually works with respect to that sort of training and that kind of building those practices, building that muscle, I think would be really helpful.
Great, thank you, Fiona. And now we're reaching the top of the hour, so I'll maybe highlight this as a last question, and then we'll invite our Associate Dean, Kathy Hawks, to join us for some closing remarks. But this question relates to peer schools, peer business schools. Who do you see out there who is doing this really well, and what can we learn from them as we implement our own efforts here at Sloan?
I'll share with you two things we've heard. The first one is from, that's a tough question because my answer may sound self-serving. Let's just say that we've heard from folks who've been in contact with the other schools, that some of the things that we've been able to accomplish in this short period of time, they couldn't imagine that it could be accomplished. And so it's true that we would like to partner with our peer institutions, but Sloan is uniquely Sloan. And it's important for us to be mindful of that fact. I want to build on the answer that Fiona gave to the issue of diversity. Ultimately, for us, this is about community. But when I'm thinking about joining a community, one of the first things I look at, what proportion of the people look like me? And then I start to ask questions about how I might experience that community. And so our focus on representation isn't because we value representation in itself. It's also because we understand that's the first thing people are going to look at. And if we can improve on those metrics, then we can also show to other people the improvements that we're making on the community side. And so what peer institutions are we looking to? I think right now we're spending most of our time trying to figure out how we can work better together as a school.
Yeah, I just want to underscore, I think Ray is exactly right. And I don't think we're being I mean, I think, look, this is a struggle. I mean, you know, I think for business schools in general, for management schools, this is not been something that has always been top of the agenda. I mean, I think, to be very frank, I think the management schools have probably made more progress when it comes to gender representation and inclusion, although I still think, speaking as a tenured senior female faculty member, that there's a ways to go. I think around race, we have a tremendous amount of work to do. And so we really do look to our colleagues and our peer schools to work collaboratively. As Ray said, I mean, we have to think about the faculty pipeline. We have to think about ways that we can work together. If management schools work together to work with large corporations, I think we can make a big difference there. And if we can work, as a number of you have suggested, with the venture community, you know, there are ways in which collective action by the leading management schools, I think, can also make a difference in shaping you know, the much larger economic institutions that we are part of.
Great. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Fiona. We have quite a few questions that have come in on the Zoom, so we will share those with our presenters. And then we will also send a survey and follow-up email about this event and a recording to the session. So we appreciate both of your time. And with that, we'd love to turn it over to Kathy Hawks.
Thank you so much, Greg. And thank you to Ray and Fiona, both for leading us through this such an important time and presenting to us today and continuing the conversation and engaging with our alumni and being our partner in external relations. So I'm so grateful to both of you for that partnership. And thank you to Sree for also leading our alumni board through this important time. We couldn't do it without his partnership. And I want to thank all of the alums that joined us today. I think we were around 150 at our high water mark today. And thank you for all of your questions and engagement throughout this process. This will be a first of many conversations, I hope, because at MIT, we know it's about the work, and it's the beginning of that work together and working on our community together. One of the inspiring things this spring was to see alums leap into action, and I have to thank so many of you who did that and help us raise over $700,000 for the Immediate Needs and Emerging Opportunities Fund, which helped support our students this spring and really get us going on our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So thank you to all of the donors to that fund. Please, to all of our alumni, continue to show up, share your ideas with us, and engage. And until we can be together again, be safe and be well.